When a train is stranded by snow, completely cut off from the world, how can a man be murdered inside a locked compartment? With no way in and no way out, the detective realized the killer had never left. Chapter 1. The thought circled in Inspector Alistair Finch's mind, a slow, cold spiral, much like the snow descending outside his window. The Alpine Star had ceased its rhythmic journey 6 hours ago. The transition from motion to stillness had been gradual, a heavy sigh of steam and a slow surrender to the inevitable. Now it stood as a monument of polished mahogany and brass, trapped in a silent, white wilderness somewhere in the remote vastness of the Swiss Alps. The year was 1933, and the world beyond this carriage felt 1,000 miles away. Finch had been in the lounge car, nursing a weak tea, attempting to read a worn copy of Plato. He was not on duty. He was, in fact, returning from a tiresome conference in Vienna, a conference where men had spoken loudly of progress, while the shadows in the corners of the room grew visibly longer. He craved silence, and for the first few hours, the snowbound train had been a blessing. The silence of the Star was not empty. It was filled with the faint, metallic groans of the carriage settling, the whisper of the wind against the double-paned glass, and the relentless, hypnotic pat-pat-pat of heavy flakes striking the roof. It was a perfect sound for sleep. Until it was broken. It was not a scream, it was nothing so jarring. It was, instead, a persistent, measured rapping, not on his compartment door, but on the main door of the lounge car, which slid open to reveal the train's conductor, Herr Wagner. Wagner was a man defined by his crisp uniform and unflappable professionalism. To see him now, with his cap slightly askew and his face the color of weak milk, was the first true note of alarm. "Inspector Finch," Wagner said, his voice low, respectful but strained. He knew Finch, not by reputation, but as the quiet Englishman in compartment 4 who always tipped fairly and asked for nothing. "Your assistance, it is required." Finch placed his book upon the velvet seat, marking his page with a practiced fold. He did not hurry. In his experience, haste was the enemy of observation. He followed Wagner through the narrow, swaying corridors. The train was not swaying, the sway was in Wagner's step. They passed the dining car, where the few remaining passengers, 8 in total, excluding Finch and the victim, were gathered. They were huddled around the small bar, their expensive clothes looking misplaced against the backdrop of the unfolding Arctic night. Finch saw the anxiety in their postures. The American industrialist, Silas Croft, drumming his thick fingers on the bar, the young Contessa di Sforza, wrapped in furs, staring at her own reflection in the dark window, the German Dr. Weiss, polishing his spectacles with obsessive care. They were annoyed by the delay, but not yet frightened. They did not know. Wagner stopped at compartment 7, the most luxurious suite on the train. "It is Lord Harrington," Wagner whispered, his breath plumbing in the cold corridor. The heating in this car felt weaker, as if the train's heart was slowing. He did not answer for the evening service. "I used my master key. The bolt, it was thrown from the inside." "You forced the door?" Finch asked, his voice a low rumble. "There was no need. A passenger, the doctor, Dr. Weiss." He noted Wagner paused, searching for the word. "The stillness. He helped me force the lock mechanism. It was difficult. The bolt was strong." Finch nodded, running a gloved hand over the brass handle. He pushed the door open. The compartment was dark, save for the blue-white light of the snow-laden world outside. Wagner fumbled for the light switch. The compartment clicked, illuminating in a soft, amber glow. Lord Harrington was not in his bed. He was seated in the plush, high-backed velvet armchair facing the window. He looked for a moment like a man lost in thought, contemplating the storm. A heavy brandy glass sat on the small table beside him, half full. A cigar lay extinguished in a heavy crystal ashtray. But Lord Harrington was not contemplating. His head was slumped at an angle that the human neck was not designed to hold. His eyes, wide and glassy, stared at the impossible landscape of white. Finch stepped inside. The air was thick, still, and held the faint, acrid scent of burnt almonds, barely perceptible beneath the heavier aroma of cigar smoke and old leather. "Do not touch anything, Herr Wagner," Finch said, though it was unnecessary. Wagner was pressed against the doorframe, unable to move further. "Where is Dr. Weiss?" He returned to the dining car. He said there was nothing to be done. He said it was instantaneous. Finch moved slowly into the room. It was, as Wagner had said, a sealed box. He examined the door first. The heavy brass bolt was indeed in the locked position, and the wood around the mechanism was splintered, the brass plate warped, clear evidence of the forced entry the lock had held. He turned to the window. It was a solid pane of thick glass designed to withstand the pressures of the mountains. The latches were firmly closed, and the edges where the glass met the wooden frame were sealed with a thick, opaque layer of ice. Not frost, but solid ice, formed by the heat of the carriage meeting the sub-zero wind. It had not been opened in days, perhaps weeks. He knelt by the body. Lord Harrington, a man of perhaps 50, with a reputation that had preceded him onto the train. A disgraced aristocrat, they whispered in the dining car, lost his ancestral home to cards, his wife to a scandal. He was traveling, it was said, to less discerning climates. Finch looked closer, using a small pocket lens. He ignored the smell of almonds. Cyanide was a messy, obvious poison, and the glass of brandy was untouched. His eyes scanned the man's face, the graying temples, the expensive silk smoking jacket. And then he saw it. On the side of the neck, just below the ear, almost hidden by the high collar of his shirt, was a single, minuscule dark spot. Not a bruise, a puncture, as fine as a bee's sting or a delicate needle. Finch stood up, his gaze sweeping the compartment. A sealed room, a victim killed by a method that required proximity, a bolt locked from the inside. "How, Inspector?" Wagner's voice trembled. "The snow, it is 10 feet deep, no one can get on, no one can get off. The windows are sealed, the door was bolted. Was it a ghost?" Finch did not look at the conductor. His eyes were scanning the compartment's other features. The walls were paneled in rich, dark walnut. A heavy Persian rug covered the floor. A small, ornate ventilation grill was set high near the ceiling, but it was barely wide enough for a mouse. And its brass cover was filmed with the undisturbed dust of a long journey. His eyes tracked from the ventilator, across the ceiling, to the heavy brass luggage rack that ran the length of the compartment, high above the door and the chair. It was empty, save for a folded woolen blanket. "The killer never left," Finch murmured, repeating his initial thought. But the room was empty, save for himself, Wagner, and the deceased. He stepped back, his mind working not with passion, but with the cold, slow logic of a chess master assessing a locked board. The passengers were all in the dining car, Wagner had confirmed, all 8, all visible to each other for the past 3 hours. A perfect, communal alibi. The bolt was locked from the inside. The window was sealed by ice. The ventilator was too small. The victim died instantly. Therefore, the equation was impossible. Finch was a man who did not believe in impossible equations. He believed in flawed variables. He put his hands behind his back and walked the small perimeter of the room. 1, 2, 3 steps. He stopped at the table. He looked at the brandy, then at the cigar. He looked at the chair. He looked at the floor. He stepped over to the luggage rack, directly above where Harrington sat. He was not a tall man, but he reached up, his gloved fingers tracing the polished brass rail. He felt the dust. It was fine, gritty. He traced it back toward the wall, and then his finger stopped. It was not dust. He looked closer, squinting in the dim amber light. There, resting on the dark wood of the rack's base, was a small, delicate pile of fine, crystalline powder. It was almost like salt or sugar, but it had no scent. And beneath it, where the powder met the wall, his fingernail caught on something. It was not the smooth varnish of the walnut panel. It was a tiny, almost invisible scratch in the wood, fresh and sharp. A tiny, horizontal line, no longer than his thumbnail. Finch stared at the powder and then at the scratch. He looked down at the victim in the chair and then at the locked bolt on the door. The silence of the train deepened, and the inspector knew that the sleep of the passengers and his own was now truly over. The ghost had a method, and the method had left a trace. Chapter 2: The Alibi of the Eight. The silence in Compartment 7 was absolute, broken only by the sound of Inspector Finch's own breathing, slow and measured. He stood for a long moment, his gaze fixed on that tiny scratch, that small, impossible pile of crystalline dust. They were facts, facts in a room that defied logic. A ghost does not leave residue, a phantom does not scratch varnish. Finch carefully retrieved a small, waxed paper envelope from his waistcoat pocket. He kept such things for collecting samples, pollen, tobacco ash, fibers. With the edge of his pocket knife, he carefully scooped the fine white powder into the envelope, folded the top, and placed it securely in his breast pocket. He then used his lens to study the scratch again. It was horizontal, deliberate, not a random mark of passing luggage. It was the mark of a tool or perhaps a mechanism. He turned to the conductor, who was still frozen in the doorway, his knuckles white where he gripped the frame. "Herr Wagner," Finch's voice was a low murmur, yet it cut through the man's paralysis. "You will return to the dining car. You will lock this door from the outside and will retain the master key. You will tell the passengers that Lord Harrington is unwell, that he is not to be disturbed. Do not under any circumstances mention what you have seen. Do not use the word death. Panic is a contagion, and we are in a very small, very cold box." Wagner nodded, his eyes wide. "And you, Inspector?" "I will be with you presently. I must look at the adjoining compartments. Go and be calm. Your calm is the only thing holding the civility of this train together." Wagner, given a purpose, regained a fraction of his composure. He nodded sharply, pulled the door shut, and the heavy thunk of the exterior lock engaging was the only sound. Finch was now alone with the deceased. He did not look at Lord Harrington, he looked instead at the walls. He ran his palms over the polished walnut paneling, pressing gently. He was searching for a hollow sound, a hidden panel, the classic trope of a locked room mystery. There was nothing. The Alpine Star was a marvel of modern engineering, built of solid steel and thick, sound-dampening wood. He examined the floor, lifting the corner of the heavy Persian rug, nothing but polished floorboards tightly sealed. He looked at the ventilation grill again high on the wall. He dragged the heavy armchair, the one not occupied by the victim, and stood upon it. He held his pocket watch up to the grill. The delicate silver chain did not stir. There was no draft. He peered through the brass mesh. Blackness and dust. Thick, settled, undisturbed dust. He had dismissed it. He was correct to dismiss it. He stepped down, his mind returning to the powder. He looked at the window, sealed with ice. He looked at the door, bolted from the inside until forced by Wagner. The problem, he reasoned, was not in the room. The problem was in his perception of the room. He was assuming the room was sealed before the murder. What if it was sealed after? But how? A killer escaping through the window would have left a clear sign in the ice, and the cold that would have flooded the compartment would have been noticeable to anyone in the corridor. Fleeing through the door and somehow bolting it from the outside, it was a trick Finch had read about in cheap detective novels involving string or wire. He examined the bolt and the frame. There was no hole, no string, no clever mechanism, just a solid brass bolt, now warped from being forced. He had to accept the premise: the room was locked, the killer was not inside, the victim was. Therefore, the killer had operated from a distance. But the puncture wound, so small, so precise, it suggested intimacy, a needle, a sting, not a bullet from afar. He put his hand on the cold window. The vibration of the wind was faint. He adjusted his tie, took one last look at the still figure of Lord Harrington, and left the compartment, locking it behind him. The walk to the dining car was a journey through a frozen artery. The train was cold. The heaters were fighting a losing battle against the Alpine night. The corridor lights flickered, their electricity drawn from the train's dying generator. Each carriage was separated by a heavy door and a rattling, ice-caked connecting plate. As he passed from Lord Harrington's car to the next, he was struck by the sheer, oppressive weight of the silence. The snow was a blanket, insulating them from all sound, from all hope of rescue. He reached the dining car. The murmur of voices stopped the instant he entered. 8 pairs of eyes focused on him. They were the last bastion of civilization, huddled under the dim Art Deco lamps, the crystal on the tables reflecting the dark, swirling snow outside. Herr Wagner stood near the bar, looking relieved to see him. Finch did not sit. He stood in the center of the car, his hands clasped behind his back. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm, projecting just enough to fill the space without startling. "I am Inspector Alastair Finch. I was a passenger. I am afraid I must now resume my duties." He paused. He watched them. Silas Croft, the American industrialist, thick-necked and impatient, slammed his empty glass on the bar. "Duties? What duties? Your duty is to tell us when this damned train is moving. I have a merger in Zurich that won't wait for a blizzard." "I am afraid, Mr. Croft," Finch said evenly, "that the delay is no longer our primary concern. Lord Harrington has been found dead in his compartment." The reaction was a wave of inhaled breath. The young Contessa, Ilara di Sforza, brought a gloved hand to her mouth. Her dark eyes, which had been listless, were now sharp, analytical. Dr. Weiss, the German, merely nodded, as if Finch had confirmed a diagnosis. "I told Herr Wagner it was instantaneous. A tragedy." "A tragedy," Finch agreed, his gaze sweeping the others. There was a young English couple, the Fairweathers, on their honeymoon, looking pale and frightened. A stern, elderly woman in black lace, Miss Agatha Dunn, who looked merely annoyed. And a quiet, dark-haired man in a tweed suit, Mr. Thorne, who had been reading a book of poetry and had not yet looked up. "Herr Wagner informs me," Finch continued, "that you have all been in this car since the train was forced to stop." "That's right," Croft boomed. "Every last one of us, stuck here, we've been playing cards, drinking this swill, ask anyone." "Everyone?" Finch's gaze settled on the quiet man, Thorne. Thorne finally lifted his head. His eyes were grey and clear. "I was here, Inspector. I've been watching the snow." "Except," Finch said, turning to the doctor, "for yourself, Dr. Weiss. You and Herr Wagner left this car to check on Lord Harrington." "Correct," Weiss said, polishing his spectacles. "Herr Wagner was concerned. I offered my assistance. We found the door bolted. We forced it. We found him as you saw him. I touched only his neck to confirm the absence of a pulse. I then returned here. I was gone perhaps 6-7 minutes." Next to him, the Contessa di Sforza spoke, her voice a low, melodic husk. "And I saw them both leave, Inspector, and I saw them both return. Neither was gone long enough to do, well, that, and they were together." A perfect circular alibi. The 8 passengers provided an alibi for each other, and the only 2 who left, Weiss and Wagner, provided an alibi for each other. "The door," Finch said, letting the words fall into the heavy silence, "was bolted from the inside." The air in the car changed. It was no longer a room of annoyed travelers. It was a cage. The young bride, Mrs. Fairweather, let out a small, muffled sob. But if it was bolted from the inside, how? "That is the question I must answer," Finch said. Silas Croft pushed himself off his bar stool. "What are you implying, Inspector? That one of us?" He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "The man was a degenerate, drank himself into a stupor every night. He probably had a heart attack, a stroke. This is a waste of time." "His heart," Finch said, his voice dropping colder, "was perfectly fine. This was not a natural death. A murder has been committed." He let that sink in. "I will require to search every compartment," Finch stated, "and I will need to speak with each of you, one by one." "This is an outrage," Croft began, but the Contessa laid a hand on his arm. "Let the inspector work, Silas. It is in all of our interests to resolve this unpleasantness. We are, after all, trapped here together." Her eyes met Finch's. There was no fear in them. There was something else, intelligence. Finch nodded to her. "Thank you, Contessa. Herr Wagner, please prepare the adjacent lounge car. I will speak with Dr. Weiss first." As the passengers began to whisper, their fragile alliances forming and breaking, Finch stepped back into the corridor. He did not go to the lounge. He returned to his own compartment, number 4. He locked the door, sat on his narrow bunk, and took out the small, waxed paper envelope. He opened it and poured a small amount of the white crystal into his palm. It was not salt, it was not sugar. He took a small vial of water from his wash kit and let a single drop fall onto the powder. It did not dissolve. Instead, it hissed, faintly, not a chemical reaction, but a physical one, and it grew intensely cold, the moisture of his hand freezing instantly around the crystals. Finch stared. It was a powerful desiccant, a freezing agent. But why? He looked at the scratch on the wall in his mind's eye. He looked at the powder. He thought of the luggage rack high on the wall. The killer operated from a distance. What if the distance was not horizontal, but vertical? He thought of the undisturbed dust on the ventilation grill in Harrington's room. He had been so focused on air passing through it, he had not considered it as an access point. But it was too small for a hand, let alone a man. He stood up and looked at the identical ventilation grill in his own room. He examined the brasswork. It was held in place by 4 small, identical brass screws. Finch reached into his pocket and produced a small, flathead screwdriver from his travel kit. He began to turn the first screw. It was tight, but it moved. The paint around it flaked, but the dust on it was disturbed. He looked back at the grill in his mind. The dust on the grill in Harrington's room had been undisturbed. His theory collapsed. The grill had not been removed. He sat back down, the cold crystals in his palm. A freezing agent, a small scratch, a puncture wound, a room locked from within. The killer, he realized, had not needed to enter the room. The killer had needed to introduce something into it. He thought of the victim sitting in his chair facing the window. He thought of the luggage rack high above him, the scratch, the powder. The powder had fallen from above. Finch looked up. Above the walnut paneling, there was a small 2-inch gap before the carriage's curved ceiling began, a decorative shadow line. He pulled his own chair out and stood on it. He ran his fingers along the top edge of the paneling in his own room. Smooth wood, dust. He returned to Harrington's locked compartment, let himself in, and relocked it. The smell of almond and cigar smoke was fading, replaced by the sterile cold. He climbed onto the unoccupied chair. He reached up to the shadow line above the luggage rack near where he'd found the powder. His fingers traced the top edge of the walnut panel. And then he felt it. It was not a scratch, it was a hole. A perfectly drilled, tiny circular hole, no wider than a pencil, angled down. It pointed directly at the spot where Lord Harrington's head would have been resting against the high-backed chair. Chapter 3: The Thread of Motive. The hole was a fact, a cold, drilled violation in the sanctity of the compartment. It was the diameter of a writing pencil, angled slightly downward. It was the vector. Inspector Alistair Finch stepped down from the chair, his movements slow, meticulous. He replaced the chair, his mind recalibrating the puzzle. The killer had not needed to be in the room. The killer had not even needed to be in the corridor. The killer had only needed to be in the adjoining compartment, Compartment 8. He placed his hand on the shared wall, solid walnut, thick and heavy. He could feel no vibration, hear no sound from the other side. But he knew with chilling certainty that this wall was the key. The physical how was now taking shape, a long, thin tube, a silent projectile, a needle perhaps. He thought of the puncture wound and the faint, residual scent of almonds, cyanide, delivered with the silence of a whisper through a hole drilled by a patient, steady hand. And the powder, the freezing agent, why? Perhaps the weapon was not a metal needle, but one of ice, a frozen dart of concentrated poison that would melt seconds after contact, leaving nothing but a single drop of water, indistinguishable from the sweat of a dying man, a weapon that vanished. It was an elegant, terrifying theory. Finch resisted the urge to go immediately to Compartment 8, to hammer on the door. Haste, he reminded himself, was the enemy. The killer believed the secret was safe. The killer was in the dining car, wrapped in the communal alibi. Let them remain comfortable. Let them believe the locked room was still an impossibility. He returned to the dim, cold corridor. The Alpine Star groaned, the metal contracting in the profound cold. The wind was a low, mournful flute, the only sound in the white wilderness. He made his way to the small lounge car that Wagner had prepared. It was 2 cars down, separated by rattling, ice-caked vestibules. The car was empty, save for Dr. Weiss, who sat waiting, his hands folded neatly on his knees, his spectacles reflecting the dim amber lamp. "Inspector," he greeted him, his voice clinical. Finch sat opposite him. The velvet seats were cold. "Doctor, you examined the body, however briefly. You noted the cause of death was instantaneous." Weiss nodded. "I did. There was a faint rigidity already setting in which seemed rapid, but in this cold it is not unheard of. I detected no pulse. The eyes were fixed, dilated. The man was gone." "You smelled nothing?" Finch asked, his voice a low monotone, matching the hum of the wind. Weiss hesitated, polishing his spectacles again. "It is subjective, but I believe I detected the faint, bitter scent of Prunus amygdalus, almonds. It is the classic indicator of cyanide poisoning, a massive dose." "But the brandy, Doctor, it was untouched." "Indeed," Weiss leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "It would not need to be ingested. A concentrated prussic acid, if delivered directly into the bloodstream, say via injection, the effect would be near immediate. A full-body convulsion, respiratory failure, death in less than a minute. Silent, save for a single, sharp intake of breath." Finch watched the man. He was clinical, detached, perhaps too detached. "You seem very knowledgeable on the subject, Doctor." "I am a man of science, Inspector. Toxicology is a fascinating, if morbid, hobby. Lord Harrington, however, was not my patient. I met him only last night over cards." "And your impression?" "A deeply unhealthy man," Weiss said without emotion. His hand trembled when he held his cards. His liver, I would wager, was in catastrophic condition. He was a man racing toward his own grave. It seems only that someone hastened his arrival. "Did you like him, Doctor?" Weiss permitted himself a small, thin smile. "I find liking people to be an inefficient use of emotional energy. He was a poor card player. He drank too much. He represented a class of man that is, thankfully, dying out. But I did not kill him. I was, as you know, in the dining car. And then I was with Herr Wagner." Finch nodded slowly. The alibi was sound. "One last question, Doctor. You mentioned you are a man of science. Have you ever encountered a chemical, a crystalline powder, that acts as a rapid freezing agent, a powerful desiccant?" Weiss's brow furrowed, his first sign of genuine curiosity. "A desiccant? You mean like silica? Or stronger, you are describing perhaps anhydrous salts, calcium chloride? They absorb moisture. The reaction is exothermic. It produces heat, not cold, unless you are speaking of something like an endothermic reaction, an ammonium nitrate solution. Such things are used in cold packs. But a powder that freezes on contact with ambient moisture, that is a very specific and very specialized chemical. You have not seen such a substance?" "No, it sounds highly specialized and unstable. Where did you find such a thing?" "It was a hypothetical question, Doctor," Finch said, rising. "Thank you for your time." Weiss watched him go, his clinical curiosity unsatisfied. Finch stood in the corridor, letting the information settle. Ammonium nitrate, specialized. He instructed Wagner to send for the Contessa. She entered the lounge car not with fear, but with a fluid, weary grace. Ilara di Sforza. She was wrapped in a silver fox fur stole, her dark hair immaculate, her eyes sharp and assessing. She did not wait for him to speak. "This is a dreadful business, Inspector, truly dreadful, and so clumsy." Finch raised an eyebrow. "Clumsy?" "To kill a man on a train trapped in the snow," she said, her voice a low, melodic purr. "It shows a certain lack of imagination. The list of suspects is so limited. It is like a bad drawing room play." "And yet," Finch said, "the killer is, for the moment, successful. The room was locked." The Contessa smiled, a brief, cold flash. "Locks are for honest people, Inspector. You knew Lord Harrington well." The smile vanished. "I knew of him, as did all of Vienna. He was a black hole, pulling light and money and reputation into himself. He was a stain. That sounds personal, Contessa. She looked out the window at the endless, swirling white. The reflection that stared back at her was hard, like porcelain. It was personal. 2 weeks ago in Vienna, Lord Harrington played baccarat with my cousin, a foolish young man who believes he has a system. My cousin lost. He lost more than he had. And so he offered collateral, the Villa Sforza, my family's home on Lake Como for 3 centuries. Harrington accepted. He won the villa on a single hand. Here it was, a motive, cold, clear, and powerful, the loss of an ancestral home. He ruined your family, Finch stated. He attempted to, she corrected. My cousin is an idiot, but he is not the entirety of my family. I was traveling to Zurich to meet with my bankers. I intended to buy the villa back from Harrington. I was prepared to pay him double what it was worth. And did you make this offer? I attempted to before dinner. I found him in his compartment. He was odious. He laughed. He said he enjoyed the prestige of owning a Sforza property. He said he intended to turn the gardens into a stable for his racehorses. He refused my offer. That must have made you very angry, Contessa. She turned her dark eyes on him. Anger is for those who have lost, Inspector. I had not lost. I was merely delayed. I would have found another way. Where were you when the train stopped? In the dining car, as you know. I was reading. I was observing. Observing whom? Everyone, she said. Mr. Croft, the American who was drinking heavily and complaining about his telephone. The Fairweathers, holding hands and pretending not to be terrified. Dr. Weiss, who seemed utterly bored. And Mr. Thorne, the quiet one. He was sketching in a book. You saw them all, every minute. I did, she said. From the moment we stopped until you arrived, no one left the dining car. Except, as I told you, the doctor and Herr Wagner. It is, as you see, impossible. Finch watched her. She was intelligent, cold, and had the strongest motive he had yet found. But her alibi, like all the others, was sealed, just like the compartment. Thank you, Contessa. That will be all, for now. She rose, pulling the fur tighter around her neck. Find him, Inspector, not for justice, but for aesthetics. This murderer is trapped with us, and he is, I fear, very clever. It makes one feel unsafe. After she left, Finch did not immediately move. He sat in the profound silence, a victim who cheated a noble family, a doctor with a clinical knowledge of poison, and a hole drilled from the adjoining room. He stood up. The time for indirect questions was over. He walked the icy vestibules back toward the sleeping cars. He passed Compartment 7, its door locked and forbidding. He arrived at Compartment 8. He checked the passenger manifest Wagner had given him. Compartment 8, registered to Mr. Julian Thorne. The quiet man, the poet, the sketch artist. Finch raised his hand. He did not knock. He used the master key, sliding it into the lock with a quiet, metallic click. He turned the handle and pushed the door open. Chapter 4, The Artist's Toolkit. Mr. Thorne's compartment was the mirror image of Lord Harrington's, but its soul was entirely different. Where Harrington's room was a chaos of discarded clothes, brandy bottles, and the lingering scent of smoke, Compartment 8 was a space of monastic order. The bed was neatly made. A single suitcase was tucked onto the luggage rack. On the small table by the window, a small, leather-bound book of Keats' poetry sat next to a watercolor sketchbook. The page was open to a half-finished painting. The Alps, as they had been before the storm, rendered in soft blues and sharp, cold grays. The air was still. It smelled faintly of turpentine and paper. Mr. Thorne was not present. He was, Finch assumed, still in the dining car, protected by his communal alibi. Finch closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a soft finality. He was now in the killer's workshop. He did not waste time. He went directly to the wall that adjoined Compartment 7. He ran his hand along the polished walnut. He looked up, tracing the shadow line above the luggage rack. And there it was. It was not a freshly drilled hole. It was older. The varnish around its edge was not splintered, but worn smooth. It was a peephole. Finch felt a sudden, cold wave of disgust. He pressed his eye to the hole. The view was obscene. He was looking directly into compartment 7. He could see the high-backed armchair where Harrington sat, though the body had been removed by Wagner earlier at Finch's quiet request and placed respectfully on the bed. He could see the table. He could see the door. This hole had been here for some time. His theory shifted. The killer had not drilled the hole. The killer had simply discovered it. But who had drilled it? The voyeuristic Harrington from his side, or Thorne from this side? Finch turned his attention to Thorne's luggage. The single suitcase on the rack was unlocked. He lowered it. It was heavy. He laid it on the bed and opened the brass latches. It was not filled with clothes. It was a meticulously organized artist's toolkit, small glass jars of pigment, brushes of sable and boar bristle, canisters of charcoal, and in a velvet-lined tray, a set of tools, small chisels, a burnishing tool, a small silver-plated hand drill, the kind jewelers or model makers use. Finch picked up the drill. The bit was tiny, precisely the width of the hole in the wall. He searched further. Tucked into a side pocket, he found a small tin, like one for tobacco. He opened it. It was filled to the brim with the same fine, crystalline white powder he had found on the luggage rack in Harrington's room. The how was now complete. The tools, the chemical, the vector, all here in this room. Finch closed the case. He felt the slow, grim satisfaction of a trap closing. The alibi of the dining car was the only thing that stood between Thorne and a noose. He locked the compartment, leaving everything as he had found it, and returned to the lounge car. The wind outside seemed to howl with a new, hungry intensity. He sent Wagner for Mr. Thorne. Thorne entered as quietly as a shadow. He was a man of medium height, with the pale complexion of a scholar and hands stained with ink and paint. He did not seem nervous. He seemed resigned. "Inspector," he said, his voice soft. "Mr. Thorne." Finch did not invite him to sit. He stood, his presence filling the small, cold room. "You are an artist, I see." I try to capture things, moments, light," Thorne said. "And a lepidopterist, a collector of butterflies." Thorne's gaze sharpened. "Yes, how did you?" "The powder in your case," Finch said. "A desiccant, a drying agent, to preserve your specimens." "That's correct," Thorne said, a flicker of relief. "It is potassium sulfite, harmless unless ingested in large quantities." "And the hand drill," Finch's voice was like ice. "For mounting them, I presume." Thorne's face went utterly pale. The blood drained from it, leaving it the color of paper. You went into my room." "I am investigating a murder, Mr. Thorne. A murder committed by someone who gained access to compartment 7 through a small hole drilled in the wall of your compartment." Thorne stumbled back, grabbing the doorframe for support. No, you don't understand." "Explain it to me," Finch commanded, his voice a low growl. "The hole," Thorne was breathing quickly. "I didn't drill it. He did, Harrington." This was not the confession Finch expected. "Go on," he said, his tones skeptical. I am a light sleeper," Thorne whispered. "The first night I heard a sound, a scratching, a small twisting sound. I thought it was the train. The next morning I found it, the hole. I realized he had been watching me. The man was a degenerate, a voyeur." "You did not report this." "To whom, Herr Wagner, and say what? The lord in the next room is peeking at me. I am a quiet man, Inspector. I do not seek confrontation. I covered it. I hung a painting over it. I assumed that would be the end of it." Finch absorbed this. It reversed the narrative. The victim was the perpetrator. And the drill, the powder. "It seems an incredible coincidence, Mr. Thorne, that you possess the exact tools used in the murder." "It is a coincidence," Thorne insisted, his voice cracking. "I told you, I'm an artist, a collector. I use the drill for my mounting boards, the powder for preservation. I hated Harrington, I despised what he was, but I did not kill him, I swear. I was in the dining car, I was there the entire time. I was sketching the Contessa. Ask her, ask Mr. Croft, I never left, not for a second." His terror seemed genuine. His alibi was, by all accounts, ironclad. Finch stared at the man. He was either a consummate actor or a tragically unlucky innocent. If you did not kill him, Mr. Thorne, who else knew about the hole? No one, Thorne breathed. Only me and him. Finch dismissed him. The man practically ran from the lounge. The puzzle was now infinitely more complex. The killer knew about the hole. The killer had access to Thorne's room, or the killer had their own tools. Finch was back to his central problem. How does a person who is verifiably in the dining car commit a murder in compartment 7 using a hole in compartment 8? It was impossible. Finch walked back to the dining car. He stood in the doorway. The 8 passengers were all there. Croft was now asleep, snoring loudly at the bar. The Fairweathers were huddled under a blanket. The Contessa was reading. Weiss was staring into space. Thorne was back, his hands shaking as he sketched frantically. Miss Dunn was knitting. 8 people, all watching each other. How, Finch thought, can a man be in 2 places at once? He looked at them, and then he looked past them, through the door at the far end of the dining car, the door that did not lead to another passenger car, but to the galley, the kitchen. An alibi is only as strong as the room that contains it. The passengers had been watching each other, but who had been watching the staff? The train employed a conductor, Wagner, a porter, currently missing, likely in the staff car, and a chef. Finch had been focused on the 8. He had forgotten the 3. He strode through the dining car, ignoring the startled looks. He pushed open the swinging door to the galley. The kitchen was dark, save for the blue moonlight on the stainless steel counters. It was cold, the fires in the stove long dead. It was empty. No, not empty. In the far corner, slumped against a sack of potatoes, sat a man in a white chef's uniform. His eyes were wide open. A small, dark stain was spreading across the front of his apron. And in his hand, gripped tightly, was a long, thin, hollow brass tube, a blowgun. Chapter 5: The Second Silence. The galley of the Alpine Star was a room built for fire, steam, and noise. Now, it was the coldest place on the train. The great iron stove was a block of black ice. The stainless steel counters were silver mirrors in the stark, blue-white light filtering through the snow-caked porthole. Inspector Finch stood in the doorway, his breath plumbing. The silence here was different from the silence in Harrington's compartment. That had been the silence of wealth, of velvet and thick carpet. This was the silence of function, of cold metal and hard tile, and the faint, earthy smell of potatoes and onions. The chef, Antoine, was slumped against the sacks. He was a small, neat man, even in death. His white uniform was, save for the one dark stain, immaculate. His toque blanche had fallen onto the floor beside him, a soft, deflated crown. Finch stepped inside, his shoes making no sound on the tiled floor. He knelt beside the body. The chef's eyes were open, wide with a final, quiet surprise. The stain on his apron was small, centered just below the ribcage. Finch gently parted the fabric. It was not a bullet wound. It was a puncture. A single, thin, deep puncture, like one made by a stiletto or a very fine, very sharp ice pick. Finch's gaze went to the man's hand, the brass tube. He did not touch it, not yet. He studied it. It was about 18 inches long, hollow, and finely made. The end that rested near the chef's pale lips was burnished, as if from use. A blowgun. A weapon precise enough to deliver a small, poisoned projectile through a narrow hole. It seemed, for a moment, that the case was closed. The chef, Antoine, had killed Lord Harrington. But a question hung in the frozen air, as sharp and cold as an icicle. If the chef was the killer who had killed the chef. Finch looked around the galley. It was a self-contained unit. A door to the dining car, a door to the corridor, a heavy-duty latch on the window, which was sealed shut with a thick layer of ice. He looked at the dark stain again. There was very little blood. The wound had been precise, delivered with anatomical knowledge, striking something vital. Death would have been almost as fast as the cyanide. This was not a struggle. This was an execution. Finch stood, his gaze sweeping the counters. A rack of knives, boning knives, carving knives, paring knives, all hung in their proper places, clean and gleaming, but there was one empty slot, a space for a long, thin sharpening steel or perhaps an ice pick. The killer had come prepared, or had used the chef's own tools against him. He looked at the blowgun again. The chef was the killer. He had used the peephole in Thorne's room. He had murdered Harrington, and then his partner or his master had silenced him. Finch's mind was a cold engine turning over the facts. Harrington's murder required access to Compartment 8. The chef's murder required access to the galley. All 8 passengers were accounted for in the dining car, a room that separated Compartment 8 from the galley. It was a geographical impossibility. He stepped back into the corridor and found Herr Wagner, who was nervously packing, rubbing his gloved hands together. "Wagner," Finch's voice was low. "The chef, he is also dead." Wagner did not react with shock. He seemed to have passed into a state of numbed acceptance. "Inspector, this is a nightmare. This is the end of the Star." "Focus, Herr Wagner. The passengers, they are all still in the dining car." "Yes, all of them. They are frightened. Mr. Croft is demanding brandy. The Contessa is calm, too calm. They are all there. I have been standing by the door. No one has left." "And the chef?" Finch asked. "When did you last see him?" Wagner thought, his brow furrowed. He was in the galley when the train stopped. He was meant to be preparing a cold service, sandwiches, cheese. The stoves are dead. He was in there, alone, for the past 3 hours at least. "Alone," Finch repeated. The chef had no alibi. He had the opportunity to slip out of the galley, down the corridor to Compartment 8, which Thorne had perhaps left unlocked, commit the murder, and return to the galley. "But who killed him?" Wagner whispered. "If we were all in the dining car." "There is one other," Finch said, the final variable clicking into place. "The passenger manifest, 10 passengers, Harrington, myself, and the 8 in the dining car. What about the staff, you, the chef, and—" "Thomas," Wagner said, his face draining of its remaining color. "The porter, Thomas, he serves the compartments. He takes the luggage. I have not seen him since the train stopped." "Where is he?" "His quarters are in the staff car at the very rear of the train, past the luggage car, or he could be anywhere." The train, which had felt small and claustrophobic, suddenly felt vast and dark, filled with unknown spaces. A killer was on the loose, a killer who had murdered twice, and a member of the staff was missing. "Herr Wagner," Finch said, his voice hard, pulling the conductor back from the edge of panic. "We must assume the killer is one of the passengers. The alibi is a lie, but we must also assume the worst, that this, Thomas, is either the killer or he is the third victim." Finch looked down the long, dark corridor. The lights flickered, casting long, swaying shadows that mimicked the motion of a train that was, in fact, perfectly still. The wind howled, a low, predatory sound. "We must find the porter," Finch said. "Lock the dining car, lock the galley, tell the passengers you are securing the train. Give me your master key. You and I are going to search. We start with the luggage car." Wagner nodded, a new, solid fear replacing his anxiety. Finch took the heavy ring of keys. He felt their cold weight in his hand. He was no longer just an investigator. He was the only authority left on this steel island, adrift in a sea of white. He began the long walk toward the rear of the train. Each step echoed in the frozen silence. He passed the sleeping cars, the compartments of the 8 passengers, each one a dark, silent box of secrets. He passed his own. He passed Harrington's. He reached the rattling, icebound vestibule that led to the luggage car. He slid the heavy door open. A wall of absolute cold and darkness met him. The luggage car was unheated. It was a cavern of trunks, cases, and shadows, and the only sound was the relentless, driving hiss of the snow against the metal roof. "Thomas," Wagner called out, his voice thin and high. Only the wind answered. Finch ignited a small oil lantern from his kit. The flame sputtered, then held, casting a small, brave circle of yellow light. It illuminated a mountain of expensive leather trunks, wooden crates, and in the corner, a pair of boots. Next to the boots was a dark, huddled shape. Finch raised the lantern. It was the porter. Thomas, he was alive. He was huddled against a stack of hat boxes, shivering, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it had rendered him mute. "He's alive," Wagner breathed, rushing forward. Finch put a hand on his arm, stopping him. He approached the young man slowly, as one would a frightened animal. "Thomas," Finch said, his voice quiet, calm, "my name is Inspector Finch. We are not going to harm you. What did you see?" The porter's lips trembled. He tried to speak. A small, dry sound came out. He pointed. He was not pointing at Finch. He was pointing back toward the passenger cars. I saw," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I saw a shadow. It went into the kitchen after the chef." "Who?" Finch asked, kneeling. "Who did you see?" "I don't know," Thomas wept, shaking his head. "It was one of them from the dining car. I was in the corridor checking the doors. They were all supposed to be in the car, but one of them wasn't." "You saw a passenger leave the dining car?" Finch pressed, his heart pounding with a slow, cold beat. "No, not leave. They were at the door talking to the chef. I saw them pass something to him through the door." "Who, Thomas?" The doctor," Thomas whispered. "Dr. Weiss, he passed his black bag to the chef, and the chef, he took it, and he went toward the sleeping cars." Chapter 6: The Alibi of Thread. The revelation hung in the frozen air of the luggage car. Dr. Weiss, the clinical, detached man of science. If Thomas was telling the truth, the communal alibi of the dining car was not a lie, it was a performance. Finch processed the new information with cold, deliberate logic. The chef had no alibi. The chef was the tool. Weiss, the toxicology expert, had provided the means, his medical bag, presumably containing the poison, the blowgun, the freezing agent. The chef had committed the murder, gone to Compartment 8, used the hole, and killed Harrington. He then returned to the galley. And then someone had killed him. "Did you see the doctor leave the dining car after that, Thomas?" Finch asked, his voice a low rumble. No, sir," the porter stammered, pulling the rough wool blanket tighter around his shoulders. I got scared. Lord Harrington, he was a loud man, sir, an angry man. I heard him earlier shouting at the Contessa. And then, the doctor with his bag, it felt wrong. I came here, I hid." He had hidden, and in doing so, had saved his own life. "Wagner," Finch said, turning to the conductor, "take Thomas to your own quarters, lock the door, do not under any circumstances open it, give me the key." Wagner, looking grim, nodded. He helped the shivering porter to his feet. Finch was now alone in the vast, dark luggage car. The lantern cast flickering, monstrous shadows from the piles of trunks. He held the keys in his hand, the key to the staff quarters, the key to the galley, the master key to the passenger cars. He was the only man on the train who could move freely. He was not a man who believed in coincidence. Weiss, the poison expert, the Contessa, the motive of revenge, Thorne, the owner of the tools, Croft, the loud, abrasive American capable of brute force. The murder of the chef was the key. The chef had been in the galley, the passengers in the dining car. Wagner had been standing guard at the corridor door of the dining car. He had seen no one enter or leave. But Wagner had not been watching the other door, the swinging door to the galley. But surely, Finch reasoned, in a quiet car, the passengers would have seen one of their number stand up, walk to the galley, and commit a murder. Unless they had not, Finch made his way back through the echoing, frozen train. The wind outside seemed to be clawing at the windows, seeking entry. He returned to the dining car. He stood in the corridor just outside the door. He could see them through the glass. They were a tableau of fear. Croft was now drinking directly from a bottle. The Fairweathers were asleep in each other's arms. The Contessa was writing in a small, leather-bound journal. Miss Dunn was knitting, her needles clicking with a relentless, maddening rhythm. Click, click, click. And Dr. Weiss was polishing his spectacles. Thorne was sketching, his pencil moving with frantic, bird-like speed. Finch entered. The warmth of the room, though faint, was a welcome relief. All eyes turned to him. "Inspector," the Contessa said, her voice smooth, "you look as though you have seen a ghost." "Two of them, Contessa," Finch replied, his voice resonating in the quiet. "The chef has been murdered." A collective gasp. Mrs. Fairweather let out a small, terrified cry. "My God," Croft breathed, setting his bottle down. We are being picked off, one by one. Dr. Weiss looked up, his expression one of professional interest. How, Inspector, if we were all here? That doctor, Finch said, is the question I am here to answer. He did not look at Weiss. He looked past him. His gaze settled on the bar. The bar in the dining car was an L shape. One side faced the passengers. The other, shorter side was pressed against the wall that separated the dining car from the galley, and in that wall there was a small sliding hatch, a service window for passing drinks and food. It was currently closed. Finch walked over to it. He put his hand on the small brass handle. Herr Wagner guarded the corridor door. Ladies and gentlemen, he assures me none of you left that way. He slid the hatch open. A puff of cold, dead air from the galley, smelling faintly of potatoes, entered the car. But no one, Finch continued, was guarding this. He peered through the hatch. He had a clear, direct view of the galley kitchen, and he could see, on the floor, the outline of the chef's body. The killer had not needed to leave the dining car. The killer had simply needed to call the chef to the service window. The chef alone, preparing sandwiches. A passenger calls his name. He walks to the hatch. He slides it open. He looks through, and the killer, sitting perhaps no more than 3 feet away, strikes. A single silent thrust with a long, thin weapon, an ice pick. The chef stumbles back. The killer slides the hatch closed. The murder is complete. The killer has never left his seat. Finch turned back to the room. The alibi, Finch said, is perfect because none of you did leave. One of you merely reached through. He looked at the seating. The bar stools were closest. Sealer's Croft had been sitting there, but the tables were also close. Dr. Weiss had been at the table nearest the bar. So had the Contessa. So had Mr. Thorne. The communal alibi was a shared, guilty secret. They were all watching the door, but not each other. Who was at the bar? Finch asked. I was, Croft said, his voice a low growl. What of it? And I, said the Contessa, was at this table with Dr. Weiss. I was at the next table, Thorne offered, his voice shaking. Finch looked at the dark-haired, quiet poet. Mr. Thorne, you are an artist, you observe. You were sketching the Contessa, you said. Yes, I was, Thorne stammered. And Dr. Weiss, did you sketch him? No, he was very still, he was thinking. No, Finch said, he was not thinking, he was waiting. He turned to Weiss. You passed your bag to the chef, Doctor. He was your accomplice. He killed Harrington for you. Why, what did Harrington have on you? A malpractice suit? A scandal in Berlin? Weiss said nothing. He simply watched Finch, his face a mask of clinical detachment. And then your accomplice became a liability, Finch continued. You had to silence him, you called him to the hatch. He trusted you, he opened it, and you disposed of the problem. That is a fascinating theory, Inspector, Weiss said, his voice smooth. But it is just that, a theory. You have no proof. You have the word of a frightened porter and a hole. I, on the other hand, have the testimony of 7 other people that I have not left this chair. You did not have to, Finch said, but you did have to retrieve your weapon. He looked at the bar. He looked at the floor around Weiss's table. The weapon, Doctor, the ice pick, where is it? Finch walked toward Weiss. The doctor did not flinch. Finch looked at the table, he looked at the floor, and then he looked at the stern, elderly woman, Miss Agatha Dunn. She was still knitting. Click, click, click. A ball of thick grey wool sat in her lap. Finch's gaze sharpened. The wool was thick, but the needles, they were not a matched pair. One was a standard wooden knitting needle. The other was long, thin, and made of dark, polished steel. It was pointed. It was not a knitting needle at all. It was a sharpening steel from the galley, wiped clean, and currently being used to knit a grey wool scarf, its tip clicking rhythmically against its wooden partner. Miss Dunn paused, her hands freezing mid-stitch. She looked up, her bird-like eyes meeting Finch's. A very clever theory, Inspector, she said, her voice like dry leaves, but you are looking at the wrong man. Chapter 7, The Cold Equation. The dining car of the Alpine Star fell into a silence so profound that the click, click, click of Miss Dunn's needles sounded like hammer blows. All eyes, the frightened, the drunk, the analytical, settled on the elderly woman in black lace. She, in turn, did not look at Inspector Finch. She continued her rhythmic work, the grey wool spooling through her fingers, the mismatched needles rising and falling. Finch stepped closer, his shadow falling over her work. "Miss Dunn," he said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that barely disturbed the air. "That is not a knitting needle." Miss Dunn paused. She lifted the long, thin, dark steel rod, the point gleaming faintly in the amber light. "No, Inspector," she said, her voice crisp and dry. "It is not. It is a spindle from a 19th century gramophone. It belonged to my father. I find the weight preferable. The balance is superior for a heavy worsted wool." She held it out to him, handle first. "You may examine it if you wish." Finch looked at the object. The tip was sharp but not blade-like. It was, as she said, a spindle. He looked at her hands, liver-spotted but steady. He looked into her flat, bird-like eyes. He saw no malice, no fear, only impatience. It was a distraction, a complex, fascinating, but ultimately irrelevant piece of the puzzle, a red herring knitted from grey wool. He did not take the spindle. "My apologies, madam," he murmured. He turned away from her, his mind returning to the central, impossible problem. The chef was killed through the service hatch. The killer had to be at the service hatch to do it, but everyone was in the dining car. The alibi was communal. "The alibi," Finch said, speaking almost to himself, his gaze sweeping the room. "The alibi is a performance. We are all actors, and we are all the audience. We watch each other. We confirm we are all here." He looked at the Fairweathers, huddled under their blanket, seeing only each other. He looked at Thorne, lost in the frantic lines of his sketchbook. He looked at the Contessa, her gaze turned inward, writing in her journal. And he looked at Silas Croft, the American industrialist, his head now resting on the polished bar, snoring heavily. "We are all here," Finch repeated, "but we are not all attentive. We are frightened. We are distracted. We are drunk." He turned his gaze, sharp and final, onto Dr. Weiss. The doctor sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the table, his spectacles reflecting the dim light, obscuring his eyes. "You, Doctor," Finch said, "are the most attentive of all. You are a man of science. You observe, you know that to hide, one must do it in plain sight." "You persist with this theory, Inspector," Weiss said, his voice calm, clinical. "A theory based on the ramblings of a terrified porter. It is insufficient." "It was," Finch agreed, "until I understood the true nature of this room. This room is not a cage, Doctor. It is a stage. You told us you never left your chair, and the Contessa confirmed it, and Mr. Thorne confirmed it." "You see, an impossible equation," Weiss said, allowing a small, thin smile. "But you did leave your chair," Finch said, his voice dropping. "You stood up. You walked the 4 steps to the bar. You poured yourself a drink, or perhaps you checked on Mr. Croft, and in that moment you were at the service hatch." "Everyone would have seen me," Weiss countered. "They did see you," Finch said, "and they forgot. It was a normal movement, an insignificant action, a man getting a drink in a stalled train. While you were there, you called to the chef. 'Antoine,' you whispered. He slid the hatch open. He trusted you, and you." Finch's eyes went to the bar, to the ice bucket, and to the long, thin, wickedly sharp ice pick resting beside it. No, the ice pick was missing from the galley, not the bar. "And you used the weapon you had prepared, the ice pick from the galley, which you took from the chef when you gave him your medical bag. A simple exchange, poison for a tool." "And where is this weapon now, Inspector?" Weiss asked, his voice laced with academic curiosity. "Am I to assume it is in my pocket? You are welcome to look." "No, Doctor," Finch said. "It is not in your pocket. To keep it would be foolish. To throw it in the snow would be impossible. You had to dispose of it, immediately. But how, in a room full of witnesses?" Finch's gaze moved from Weiss to the man snoring beside him, Silas Croft. The American was a large man, his suit jacket rumpled. His breathing was a deep, alcoholic rumble. Finch walked slowly, deliberately to the bar. He stood over the sleeping American. The Contessa watched, her pen frozen above her journal. Thorne stopped sketching. The only sound was Miss Dunn's needles. Click, click, click. Finch did not wake Mr. Croft. He simply reached down, his movements precise, and unbuttoned the industrialist's heavy tweed jacket. He slid his hand inside, into the interior breast pocket. His fingers brushed against something hard, thin, and cold. He withdrew his hand. In his gloved palm, he held the ice pick. It was 9 inches long, needle-sharp, and the dark, ornate handle was sticky with drying blood. The room, which had been silent, became utterly breathless. Silas Croft snorted in his sleep. Dr. Weiss did not move, he did not speak, he simply watched. The reflection in his spectacles broke, and Finch saw the man's eyes for the first time. They were not clinical, they were not calm. They were the eyes of a chess master who has just had his king unexpectedly toppled from the board. "Elegant solution, Doctor," Finch murmured. "You retrieve the ice pick from the chef under the guise of giving him instructions. You return to your seat, you wait, you bide your time. When you see your moment, perhaps Mr. Croft here was complaining or Mrs. Fairweather cried out, you stand. A simple, normal motion. You walk to the bar, you call the chef. You strike 1, 2, 3 times through the hatch. You slide it closed. And in the second before you turn around, you slip the weapon. The evidence into the pocket of the unconscious man beside you. The perfect, temporary disposal. Who, after all, would disturb the drunken American?" Weiss slowly, carefully began to polish his spectacles. "He was a complication," Weiss said, his voice a dry whisper. "Harrington, he knew of my work in Berlin, experiments that were frowned upon. He funded them. And then he threatened me. He saw me as a tool just as I saw the chef." "And the chef?" Finch asked. "A simpleton," Weiss said with no emotion. "He owed me his life, or so he believed. I had assisted his wife. He was devoted. He believed Harrington was an evil man. It took little persuasion, but he was weak. He was panicking. He would have confessed. He too was a complication. In science, Inspector, one must be ruthless in eliminating complications." He placed his spectacles back on his nose. "You are a very clever man, Inspector, a man of logic. I appreciate that." He looked at the Contessa, he looked at Thorne, he looked at the sleeping Croft. "It seems," Dr. Weiss said, "that the equation is, after all, solved." Finch stood as the first, faint rays of a grey, stormy dawn began to filter through the windows. The blue-white of the Alpine night was surrendering to a bruised, cold purple. The Alpine Star was still a prisoner, a line of dark steel in an endless, silent world of white. He could hear far in the distance a new sound, not the wind. It was the heavy, rhythmic chug of a snowplow engine working its way up the mountain. Rescue was coming, but Inspector Finch did not feel relieved. He looked at the 2 bodies that lay in the cold, silent carriages. He looked at the murderer who sat calmly, as if waiting for a lecture to begin. He looked at the survivors, their innocence, such as it was, now frozen and fractured. He turned his back on them all and stared out the window. The snow was still falling, slow and hypnotic, covering the tracks, covering the secrets, but it could not cover the truth. The ghost had been found, and it was, as it always was, painfully, tragically human.